October the 1st, this year, the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. Now, it has been a practice for some 15 years to proclaim major state events such as that, the 1st of October, as reflecting what has been used in the traditional language as being part of a shengshi. The Chinese term shengshi came into fashion, as I said, about 15 years ago. It's used constantly. This is an appearance of, it says shengshi in the Chinese characters. It's a term that means golden age or unique moment, great moment. And it has been used by leaders since, in particular, the Hu Jintao. Why it's significant this year, I'll tell you in a moment. The expression is in fact so common that in 2010 I invited a group of colleagues from University UC Berkeley, from Harvard, UBC in Vancouver, and Monash in Melbourne, and the Free University in Berlin to produce a special issue of the journal I was publishing then called China Heritage Quarterly on the topic of shengshi, prosperous China, or the political golden age of communist rule in the People's Republic. That journal issue can be seen online still. We also mentioned and went through the whole cultural background and the political significance, also economic meaning of this term and the type of world it was evoking in that issue. Now, Chinese rulers have marked prosperous ages, or shengshi, for nearly 2,000 years. But in the annals of Chinese autocracy, they are actually as rare as hen's teeth. There's only a few that are even marked. What is interesting this year, in particular of all years, is that following the 1st of October, we have seen the 4th plenum of the Chinese Communist Party's 19th Congress. At the time of the Congress, the party announced that China had entered a different type of shengshi. It announced what was called Zhongguo Zhizhi, the age of Chinese rule. Now, this has so far escaped international commentators, but among the Chinese commentariat, called Zhongguo Zhizhi, the Chinese commentariat in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and internationally, this has been much discussed. It is discussed because it is an extraordinary statement for China to declare that it is now the source of major, not only moment, golden age in China, but it is a major moment for the whole international community, in fact, for world history. Zhongguo Zhizhi is a declaration of Xi Jinping's arrival on every level of power and authority in a way that is quite literally, since the founding of the People's Republic, unprecedented. There's a long history. You can discuss the lineages of Chairman Mao's own world vision, or that of Deng Xiaoping or others, but they didn't use this particularly charged kind of classical Chinese language. So I recommend you have a look at that earlier issue of China Heritage Quarterly on shengshi, the prosperous age, to give you some idea of the context of what this term means and why it is being used. If you read the People's Daily, you can see the long bloviations on the topic that have been published in the last 10 days or so. Let me just mention a couple of other. Zhi, because the term is Zhongguo, China, zhi. So it just looks like China rule. What's the big deal? It relates to a much older practice that goes back to back some 3,000 years, if you believe it or not. Anybody familiar with Chinese historiography knows of the other zhi in Chinese history. They include the Chengkang zhi of the Zhou period, the Wenjing zhi of the Han Dynasty, the Zhengguan zhi of the Tang Dynasty, and the Kangxi, or it's often called Kang Yong Qian Shengshi, the Kangxi Yongzheng Qianlong period of prosperity. It's not called the zhi. But this is the 5th major, there's many minor ones, but this is the 5th great golden age of Chinese history. It just gives you an idea not only of the way that contemporary China is constantly being framed both in globalized terms but also in traditional terms. It also is a wonderful and immediate indication of the extraordinary hubris of, we call him Xi Jinping, but Xi Jinping is merely at the pinnacle of a whole body of people, advisors, cultural factors, families, interests, and so on and so forth. The Xi Jinping iceberg, we only see the very tip, but there's a lot underground behind it, and they have declared that they've moved from the shengshi of the Hu Jintao era into this unique moment of Chinese rule, which is not only a rule for China, but for the world as a whole. I know, hubristic perhaps, and also slightly comical always, but always also worth taking seriously. As I said, people may well scoff at this. I am by nature myself a skeptic. After all, one does know that it's best to announce the arrival of a golden age, or a golden age after the golden age, rather than before or during it. It's a bit dangerous to predict. I grew up in the era when I first came aware of Chinese affairs on my 15th birthday. I was born on the May 4th, 1954. In 1969, when I celebrated my 15th birthday, a friend of mine gave me Mao Zedong's speech on the May 4th. And he gave it to me just some weeks after the April 1st, April Fool's Day Congress of the Ninth Party Congress in Beijing, which I read about at the time as a 15-year-old, which declared that the Cultural Revolution was a brilliant success and that it was over. You now might not remember, but the Cultural Revolution was declared to be a great victory and to have ended on April the 3rd, 1969. A little bit premature. Anyway, with the rise of Zhongguo and this new era, we are, this is the Prosperous Age as it was featured during the period of Hu Jintao in Hong Kong. People made fun of that Prosperous Age. But it's a perfect time to be studying contemporary China for those of us interested in history, politics, economics, culture, and the great clashes of powers, because we have an opportunity to understand reality in a way that's much clearer than has been for a very long time, mostly because people are far less fooled by the types of official rhetoric that comes from China, and also encumbered by the neoliberal dreaming of the world order that has unfolded, in particular since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so I feel this is a wonderful moment to be discussing these matters. But as I said, the rise of China's contemporary China rule, or the new prosperous age, is not merely the work of Xi Jinping and his advisors. As I've said, it's been part of a process that has been unfolding for many decades now, involving Jiang Zemin and also Hu Jintao. It is grounded in ideas, in economics, in aspiration, and in history, and what we would call the cultural or social imagination of official China. That is the China that is delineated, determined, and propagated by the Communist Party and its agencies, whether propaganda, educational, cultural, United Front, or whatever. This is official China, which is the version of China that is internationally promoted. Now, as we know, under Xi Jinping and his colleagues, the People's Republic has taken a sharper edge, and there's a new focus on the grand and unfinished tasks of the past, as well as great ambitions for the future. These were all outlined first some decades ago, although they are more evident today. To regard Xi Jinping, I would say, as being some radical departure, or much more boastful or far more aggressive than the previous incumbents, I think is to somewhat misunderstand where the Communist Party has been going really since that crucial year, against an anniversary year for us this year, that crucial year of 1979, when I feel a number of things happened that revealed where China would be going in the long run. But we'll talk about that in a moment. To go back to October the 1st and Xi Jinping this year, on the same day as the Grand Parade was being marched in Beijing, and Kevin was commenting on that delineation of how these other two leaders were disappearing, being elided, and all that was remaining for the moment is Xi Jinping, Deng Xiaoping, and Mao, although in the long run it's most probable that we'll end up with Xi Jinping and Chairman Mao as the two leading lights of the 20th and 21st centuries. That is the direction that all official propaganda is headed in. On this same day, the party's main theoretical journal, which in the old days was called Red Flag, which was a flag to us all, and we read, well, some of us read with a mixture of humor but also humility. It's now called Seeking Truth, 求是. 求是 magazine, and Americans thankfully can appreciate this, the fallacy of seeking truth in an age of Trumpian mistruth and fake news. The Chinese Seeking Truth magazine is not exactly a source of truth, but is a source of major theoretical debate. On October the 1st, that magazine published a major new piece by Xi Jinping himself to celebrate his own celebration of himself and the People's Republic. And that piece is extraordinary. Again, it's gone uncommented on, but it has been widely discussed and analyzed in the Chinese official media, and it's worth reading. Sadly, there's no English translation of it. In particular, it features this man, Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor. And we'll talk about why Qin Shi Huang, oddly enough, is still important for understanding China today. Qin Shi Huang was the first emperor of the first, what is called Di Ye, the first imperial enterprise of the Chinese world. Although he ruled for only 11 years in the 200 years before Christ, 1 year short of the 12 years enjoyed by the German Third Reich, I would note, the imperial ambition and the harsh rule of the Qin dynasty in 200 BC has haunted Chinese politics ever since. In official China, that is that world I just mentioned, that's the version of China promoted by the party, Qin Shi Huang and his rule are praised for having created a unified empire with a standard writing system, for that age, modern communications, and a system beneficial to trade. It was, in reality, also a harsh, draconian era, but one still praised by the authorities in China. For unofficial China, that is the complex world of independent thought and culture of the Chinese Commonwealth, that is the rest of China within itself, and also Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the global Chinese community not aligned with the mainland and its propaganda. The Qin dynasty and Qin Shi Huang have been, for 2 millennia, a symbol of a unity forged by draconian laws, an empire created by inhuman punishments, and an ideological enterprise that is based on the crushing of intellectual and cultural diversity. Nonetheless, the Qin dynasty has enjoyed a special place both in official China, People's Republic China, and in the popular imagination for 45 years. That is in part because in March 1974, farmers in the outskirts of the city of Xi'an in Shanxi province discovered a group of buried funerary statues. They're known famously internationally as the Qin Terracotta Army. The figures were of soldiers arranged in serried ranks inside a necropolis that surrounds the tomb of that first emperor, Qin Shi Huang. That archaeological find was both ironically timely. Ironically timely. Mao Zedong, the founding ruler of the People's Republic, had himself frequently referred to his own actions and that of his Communist Party as being akin to that of the Qin emperor. The Qin emperor had, for example, famously quashed intellectual diversity by burning the books and burying the scholars. 焚书坑儒, it's called in Chinese. He rid himself not only of troublesome texts, he also deleted their authors and their potential readers as well. This was an infamy decried throughout Chinese history until the time of Mao Zedong. In fact, following the nationwide repression of dissent in the wake of the 100 Flowers movement of 1957, when men and women had been encouraged first to speak up, to comment on the Communist Party, and then had been crushed for offering their opinions in 1957-58, Mao said to his colleagues, including in particular Deng Xiaoping and Zhou Enlai — Deng Xiaoping was the man who carried out the mass intellectual repression of 57 — Mao famously remarked at a meeting with them, this is published and accessible, "What's so impressive about the first emperor?" Chairman Mao asked his audience. "He only buried 460 scholars alive. We've buried 46,000. When we suppressed the counter-revolutionaries, did we also kill some of those counter-revolutionary intellectuals? I once debated with people in those democratic parties. You accuse us of acting like the first emperor, but you're wrong. We're far worse than him. We've outdone him 100 times over. You decry us for being dictatorial like the first emperor? We admit it. What's pathetic is that you sell us short. We always have to give you the details of what we've been doing." Mao would revel in the fact in his life, and this is an expression from himself, he would say that I'm really just Marx plus Qin Shi Huang, 我是马克思加Qin Shi Huang. Qin Shi Huang and his haunting necropolis would come to mind again on October 1st this year, the day that Beijing, as I said, marked the 70th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic, and with this extraordinary parade. And that's an image from the parade. As I said, on this day, Xi Jinping published a major theoretical essay on history, political power, and the longevity of the Communist Party and its future. He in particular emphasized the Qin Empire while discussing a number of other dynastic periods, and he talked about one particular issue. He discussed what, for those of us who are interested in Chinese historical debate and contemporary politics, is known simply as the theory of dynastic cycles, 周期论, or cycle theory. And now I'll tell you about what cycle theory is and why it is so important in this October the 1st publication by Xi Jinping. You see, in early July 1945, a delegation of independent intellectuals, in fact, the type of people Mao would later decry as, oh, those democratic parties who don't quite get how really vicious we are, a delegation went to Yan'an in northwest China, the base of the Communist Party during the anti-Japanese war, the war with Japan. That delegation was going there to try and work out how to play a role in a future conciliation between the nationalist KMT government, Chiang Kai-shek, and the powerful and increasingly important Communist Party under Mao Zedong. These intellectuals went there hoping, in all of their naivety, that they could be intermediaries between these clashing forces and your good selves, the Americans. During that visit, one of the people in that delegation, on the 4th of July, 1945, had a conversation with Mao Zedong. The delegate member was a famous progressive political activist and educator, a man called Huang Yanpei. Huang Yanpei and Mao discussed what this delegation had seen in Yan'an, the workrooms, the agricultural production, the military training, the study sessions, this extraordinary independent community, this oasis of idealism and hopefulness in the midst of war and civil strife. Mao asked him, so what do you think? What have you seen? What do you feel? What questions do you have? And Huang Yanpei was very frank. After all, this was long before Mao became the great leader and the chairman of the People's Republic, or the founding ruler of. Huang said he was impressed by the collective, hard-working spirit that was evident everywhere in the Yan'an guerrilla base. But, he said, telling Mao, somebody he'd known for some time, I doubt that your frugality in simple ways and this type of communal solidarity will last, especially if you get into power. You, like every other political force that has ever achieved power in this vast nation, will inevitably give in to the ways of luxury and excess and also political corruption and infighting. How could China ever really break free of the autocratic past that it has experienced for 2,200 years since the time of Qin Shi Huang? And this is a modern sculpture of the discussion between the two, inaugurated by Xi Jinping a couple of years ago. This dialogue is a very famous dialogue in contemporary Chinese politics. But Mao said, you're wrong. We are doing something and will do something that no one in Chinese history has ever done before. We will break out of what we call this Zhou Qi Lun, this rise and fall of dynasties, the rise of popular enthusiasm, clean living, hope and possibility for greater economic advancement and political strength, eventually leading to collapse, decay, corruption, and excessive autocracy. We'll break free. We are unique. We are the change that Chinese history has been waiting for, I would say, for millennia. And Mao told Huang Yanpei, we have found a new path. We can break free of the cycle. The path is called democracy. As long as the people have oversight of the government, then government itself will not slacken in its efforts. When everybody takes responsibility, there will be no danger that things will return to how they were, even if the leader himself is gone. That exchange remains paradigmatic and famous. Those of you familiar with the last few decades of Chinese history will know that it was brought out in 1990 as a key element in the government then, arguing that the crushing of this rabble of students and protesters in Beijing in 1989 was necessary because they would lead China to chaos and anarchy, whereas the Communist Party had already proved that through its mechanisms was a democratic, unifying, and conciliatory force. You may scoff, but that has been the line since 1990. In fact, it's also the line most recently articulated shortly after October the 1st, because Xi Jinping, in early November, just at the time of the fourth plenum, which we discussed, where he declared that the age of China rule has arrived, he visited a little community in Shanghai, in a very well-heeled part of the city, and he declared, we have created something unique in China, and this will allow us to continually renew ourselves. And he called it 全过程民主, It's a new term. Nobody knows what it means. I translate it, in my way, as the alpha and omega of democratic processes, meaning we, as a political party, are absolutely democratic through our scientific methods and so on and so forth. Again, if you go and read, want to bore yourselves by reading the documents issued after the fourth plenum of the Communist Party 2 weeks ago, you'll see there are 13 points of control, regulation, and renewal and revival of the Communist Party that Xi Jinping believes, along with his colleagues, that makes China not only an ultimately perfectible system, but a constantly renewing system that will outdo, over time, all other political and economic arrangements in the world. That's why I've said to Kevin and others that Xi Jinping and his colleagues believe that they are the end of Chinese history. They're not only Fukuyama-like, they not only believe that their system works, but they believe, if you look at their timescape, that they provide the long-term answer to all of China's problems, and in fact, with Zhongguo Zhizhi, the rule of China, over time, the world's problems. I'm not a believer myself, I'm just helping you to appreciate the level, the scale, the vastness of vision that is being articulated in China by the official media and the Communist Party at the moment. One that is based in this long history of debate and discussion in China. Again, it's not unique to Xi Jinping, but it's being articulated with a clarity and purpose that is far more pointed. Today, Xi Jinping has more titles, and as I've argued elsewhere, he has more titles and direct power than Mao even had. I mean, I always say that there's been no leader as strong as since Mao. Mao never had as much power as Xi Jinping, not only in titular terms, but in practical bureaucratic terms, has today. Mao didn't need it. Mao was a genius at political rule because he played factions against each other that required that he would let them fight it out, and he would make determinations like any genius autocrat, what was the way forward, who were the goodies and who were the baddies at any particular time. Xi Jinping has formally banned factional activity. He's claimed all bureaucratic power for himself. I call him the chairman of everything because he's set up such an alternative bureaucracy to the official bureaucracy, and he has now all the levers of state power. He actually can't use them because the actual central bureaucracy is quite small and the provinces are far more powerful in many ways. But just in terms of official titles and official power, he is more powerful than Mao. Anyway, this system of control, democracy, and this admiration for the Qin Empire and belief that the Communist Party provides a way out of the autocratic bind of Chinese history. As I said, this theoretical article by Xi Jinping is not just limited to Shihuang. He goes into many other dynasties and details and declares we have developed a system that allows us to constantly renew and refresh ourselves. While he has been, making these statements, other critics in China, and these are the claps of thunder that I'll be talking about now, they have been talking about what they call this renewed Qinzhi. The word means Qin style of rule, that is autocratic, excessively centralized, dogmatic, ideologically narrow kind of repression of political difference and dissent. It's called Qinzhi. It's a very simple term, a shorthand for something far more complex. And in this era, this last 2 years in particular, there's one man that I'll discuss today in this context, and he relates to this other history, the thunderclaps that I talk of. This is an image taken from a little book produced at the time in 1978-79 of a play produced in Shanghai and then staged in Peking to mass clamor and great popularity. November 1978, this play, which was called Yu Wu Sheng Chu, which means literally where silence reigns, where there is silence, where there is an oppressive silence, Yu Wu Sheng Chu. This play in 1978 was staged just as the third plenary session of the Communist Party's 8th Party Congress was being held, which, as you may recall, really kicked off China's economic transformation over the last 40 years. This play was staged to discuss the incident of 1976, known as the Tiananmen Incident. Over a number of days in early April 1976, crowds had gathered in Tiananmen Square, and this is an image of that, at the great monument to the people's heroes, to mourn the recently dead Premier Zhou Enlai. As they lay floral tributes, and you can see them mounded up, at the monument to the people's heroes in the center of the square, some recited poems composed not only to commemorate Zhou Enlai, but also to protest against Mao Zedong and his radical supporters. Mao, who at that time was known as the Qin Emperor. He was commonly called that. I was going to university at times. That's what some of my classmates called him. The crowds increased over the days of the protests. There were scuffles with the authorities. A police post was attacked and burnt. After days of official silence, the media began to denounce the demonstrators as being part of a counter-revolutionary insurgency that they claimed was threatening China itself. The People's Armed Militia moved in on the square. They violently attacked the mourners. There were many detentions, and rumors of mass executions were rife. In the wake of those events, Deng Xiaoping, who'd just been brought back into power a few years earlier to try and bring back government normalcy to Cultural Revolution China, he was blamed for being behind all of this, accused and then ousted from office once more. And a nationwide campaign was started to denounce him. By 1978, when this play, Where Silence Reigns, Yu Wusheng Chu, was staged in Beijing, Deng Xiaoping had returned to power just a year earlier, following the famous military coup of October 1976, when the army, under the direction of Ye Jianying and with the support of the party leader Hua Guofeng, carried out a coup against 4 members of the government, known as the Gang of Four. Always, when I was a young person, called the Gang of Four, the extra on being Chairman Mao, who escaped the coup by being dead, or in fact, the coup could happen only because he was dead. The Tiananmen protests in 1978 were re-articulated and revised as being something that was progressive and positive and that helped spur on the economic changes that were about to sweep China. I mention this play because it was a turning point for many people, for Deng Xiaoping, for expressions of clamor and dissent and difference, because as this play was being staged in Beijing, a democracy wall appeared, a wall in Xidan, the Xidan part of Beijing, where young people and older people, men and women, were putting up posters calling for various kinds of reformation and change. Many of them referred back to this expression, Yu Wusheng Chu. For the expression Yu Wusheng Chu comes from a very famous poem, one of perhaps the most famous poems by Lu Xun, China's paradigmatic 20th century writer. This is the poem in his hand. I won't read it out in Chinese. I'll just read my own rough translation of it. This is a poem written in 1934 in an era of great political and social darkness, not only vis-a-vis the official nationalist government, but also because of the increased incursions into China by the Japanese Empire. And at the time, the murder of many students and independent writers, intellectuals, and political activists. The poem reads simply, "The vast population of China is adrift in the wilderness. No one dares even sing a dirge to lament their own condition. For they fear to do so, the very earth will rise up and resonate in mourning. My mind is occupied by all of this. My thoughts extend to the very limits of the known world and all its people. But suddenly, I hear a startling clap of thunder. I hear it in this empire of silence." So this is the poem that play of 1978 was referring to, which is referring to the uprising of 1976 that was crushed because it was aimed against Mao and against the Qin style of rule that people were protesting against. It was Lu Xun's 1934 poem was a terse reflection of the seemingly hopeless state of China at that time. It's a poem that was quoted and used. These lines about startling claps of thunder, suddenly hearing these resonances, was used by Red Guards when protesting against Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping and others in the 60s. It was used by Mao Zedong when commenting on China's isolation internationally. It was used in the late 70s to talk about the repression of pro-Deng Xiaoping forces. And it's been used again and again and again in Chinese debate and culture and thought to give voice to that which must be silent. I've chosen this line as the title of my talk because of 2 particular types of voices in China today that speak out against the Qinzhi, the Xi Jinping era, the Qin-style rule of China under the Communist Party at the moment. And these are voices, one in Beijing and the others in Hong Kong, which I'll turn to and say a little bit about before concluding, because I'm sure you're all growing tired of even hearing this. But they all recall this year of anniversaries in various ways. And the anniversaries I'd like to just mention to you are the May 4th protests, student uprising and protests of 1919. The successful, which was aimed mostly at the Western imperial powers and against the local Beijing government at the time for being repressive and for allowing China to basically agree to a peace treaty with Europe that put the new Republic of China at extraordinary disadvantage economically, politically, and vis-a-vis Japan. Then there's, of course, the 1949 Communist Revolution, which we've just discussed, which celebrated its 70th anniversary just a few weeks ago. Then there's the incredibly important but easily forgotten Tibetan Uprising of 1959, relevant today in many ways, but particularly because the uprising in Hong Kong has much in it that is similar. In particular, if you're familiar with the Hong Kong debate about about China from the 1980s, you'll know that people at that time, in particular the writer Lei Kwang, said at the time in 1986-87, oh, the new joint agreement between the People's Republic and the British government regarding Hong Kong's future, oh, that's just the same as the 17-point agreement reached by the Dalai Lama's Kashag cabinet and Beijing in 1951. It was betrayed in 59, and the joint agreement will be betrayed by the communists. And Hong Kong will end up in the same pathetic, horrible situation in some years to come as Tibet is today. So this is not something that suddenly occurred to those of us who follow the Chinese situation. That's why the 59 uprising in Lhasa is worth remembering. Then there's the Quelling of Red Guard protests in 1969. You might recall the Red Guards, monstrous in many ways, but in 69 the Cultural Revolution was over. The Red Guards had played their role. Let's get rid of all of them. And in particular, any Red Guard faction, and there were many, that came up with alternative political ideas or solutions, some more radical than Mao, some far less radical than Mao, they were all purged, and many people were jailed or sent off to the countryside. So that's also an anniversary that is going by this year being completely uncommented on. Then there's the famous Beijing Spring of 1978-79, that democracy war movement. One particular moment worth remembering is that it's when Wei Jingsheng, the young, they always say he's a young electrician. Well, he's a young, privileged man from a good family who went to number 101 school, which is one of the most important schools in the city, who later went on to become a worker. When he not only made his famous call for democratization in China, he also did something else. In March 1979, he published a poster on the wall that I remember clearly. I remember reading it at the time, and it's one of the reasons I left for many years. I put Chinese studies aside because of what happened. His poster just said, what do we want, democracy or a new autocrat, Deng Xiaoping? And in the poster he said that the 1978 arrangements in the Third Plenum would lead, with Deng Xiaoping's arrival and the new politics of the new era, Xin Shiqi. Xi Jinping talks about Xin Shidai. Now it's forgotten that before there was a Xin Shiqi for 25 years under Deng Xiaoping. And Wei Jingsheng said we have a new autocrat, and the party constitution and the changes to the Chinese Communist constitution, official constitution, mean that inevitably China will continue on the road of autocracy for the foreseeable future. It's one of the reasons I thought, well, I don't want to live for the rest of my life dealing with an autocratic China. I'll go and study Japanese. Didn't work out like that, but that's what made me decide that. So there was that key moment. Then there's the 1989 student protests in Tiananmen Square and in over 25 cities throughout China. Then 1999, when the Falun Gong, in April 1999, Falun Gong protesters surrounded Zhongnanhai to demand their right to practice their belief system. Odious though I think it is, I support their right to those protests. And they, as you know, they were repressed as an evil cult and have been repressed now for 20 years. Also in 1999, I just mentioned this to Kevin, and if you're interested in the longer, complex, sorry history of anniversaries in China, 1999 also marks one other little moment. In 1999, just on the eve of the October the 1st National Day celebrations marking the 50th anniversary of the People's Republic of China, a journalist and editor by the name of Chen Min, writing under the name Xiao Shu, laughing Sichuan province, Xiaoshu, published a book called The Promises of History. 庄严的承诺历史的先声. It's available online. If you know Chinese, you can download the whole book. What it contains is interviews, essays, editorials, commentaries, and statements made by Mao Zedong, Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, Zhou Enlai, and many others from 1942, from that moment when Huang Yanpei and Mao had that dialogue, until 1949, in which the leaders of the Communist Party publicly, throughout the Republic of China, repeatedly declared that they would introduce universal suffrage, they would ensure basic human rights, that they would carry out reforms that would transform China into a modern, democratic, egalitarian, and hopeful society along the lines of the best type of political practice known internationally. They would not be radical socialists, and they would not create a dictatorial system like the KMT. If you're interested in when the communists today say, but the Chinese people chose us in the 40s, and therefore we're just carrying out the wishes of the Chinese people. Well, yes, just see what they promised the Chinese people for 7 years, non-stop. It's all available in Xiaoshu's wonderful book, published in 1999 and banned immediately and pulped. I luckily was able to buy a copy. But as I said, it's all available online. As I said, many of these things continue to resonate in the Chinese world today. I'll now turn, sorry, I'm going on far too long, but I'll now turn to this particular statement from the Qin Shi Huang era that has come to resonate again in the last 2 years. This is a statement that merely means the refusal of 千人之诺诺不如一世之恶恶, means literally the refusal of one decent man outweighs by far the acquiescence of the multitude. That man just say no, I think, that, to quote a former American authority figure. This comes from the biography of Lord Shang, Shang Junlie Zhuan, from Sima Qian's historical records in the Han Dynasty. It's a very famous line. Shang Jun, the Lord Shang, was the man, looks like the Hu Qiaomu of his era. He's the, sorry to underestimate Lord Shang. He was the man who came up with the ideas 150 years before Qin Shi Huang got into power to how to manage an empire. He was the man who framed the ideas for social, political, and intellectual control that would underpin Qin Shi Huang's own 第业 imperial enterprise. So if you really want to understand some of the underpinnings of Chinese autocracy, Lord Shang is the man to go to. Anyway, in his biography, this line appears when they're discussing opposition to him and various ideas related to such matters. It's a line made famous by my own teacher, Simon Leys, Pierre Ryckmans, in his famous early 1970s book called The Chairman's New Clothes, which is the first critique of the Cultural Revolution and Mao Zedong that really gained traction internationally. The epithet to that book in Chinese on the flyleaf is this line. No translation, and it's Pierre's view of himself. So that's when I first came across it, many of those 45 years ago or so. It's a line, and the words in it have been used frequently by a Beijing law professor who appeared in a very public forum, in a public way, mid-last year, when he launched the most thoroughgoing and continuous attack and critique of Xi Jinping and the Communist Party today. This is a man by the name of Xu Zhangrun. He's a law professor at Tsinghua University. He's still a law professor as of yesterday at Tsinghua University. I mention that because I'm his translator. We're in touch, now only by email, and I've been working on his work for the last year and a half. He's been under a formal investigation directed by the Department of Propaganda, Ministry of Propaganda, by the Politburo, by his university. He's been investigated for 6 months. He's been told the investigation is concluded, that the university has come to its own decision, but it's passed up its opinion to its superior authorities, because Shihuang has become such a famous and controversial figure that one fears that the man who Shihuang calls the main axle drive, Dangzhou, i.e. Xi Jinping. He also calls him You Si, that which is in power, and Yu Yiren, the one. He never mentions Xi Jinping. He just uses a series of classical expressions to refer to that guy. He sometimes calls him the idiot as well, but that's another matter. I've translated, it's all available online, China Heritage, if you're interested in much of Shihuang's extraordinary work. Anyway, Mid-last year, Xu Ranrun wrote a very famous essay called Present Fears and Pressing Anxieties and Immediate Hopes. It's in fact one piece in a series of major essays he began publishing in early 2016 that are an analysis of China's political, economic, cultural, intellectual, and historical crisis that are extraordinary in their scope and in their depth, also in their style. Xu Ranrun writes this type of essay anyway in what can only be, there's a certain type of way of expressing it in Chinese. It's a semi-classical Chinese style. It's as if he is writing a Chinese that will frequently quote Greek and Latin writers, as well as Chaucer, Shakespeare, as well as South Park. He does it all. And it's a particular, say, in Guangdong, in Guangdong in the south, there's a particular writing style known as Sam Kap Dai, San Ji Di, which I became familiar with when I worked in Hong Kong from the late 70s, in which one combines classical Chinese, modern Chinese, and colloquial doggerel everything in a particular style. And it's developed in Guangdong in the last 100 years or so and reached a real apogee in Hong Kong from the 1940s and 50s onwards. It's still written by some people, but relatively rarely. And it's a style I particularly enjoy. And it's a style, thankfully, I read as a 20-year-old, or my 20s, because it prepared me to read Xu Ranrun's type of writing, because he writes in a highly erudite, but often very also humorous, undercutting, and colloquial way. So his first famous essay, Pressing Anxieties and Immediate Hopes, appeared mid-last year. It's 10,000 words in Chinese characters. English is 25,000 words. You need lots of words to explain it. Notes, another 15,000 to make sense of all the asides, comments, and references that he makes. However, it immediately struck a chord, both in China and internationally. It was also immediately banned in China, but has been widely read. And that is because he listed all the reasons why he thought the communists had done some basic good for China in the last 40 years, after 30 years of betrayal, internecine warfare, class struggle, and incredible violence and loss of life. And he offers a positive analysis of the communists and their achievements. He then goes on to talk about the areas in which he feels the Communist Party is now threatening all of the things that it's achieved. And he says why. And then he offers a series of suggestions. This is what you can do to prevent the disaster that you are now engaged in. What had spurred this particular piece mid-last year was the revision of the Chinese constitution in March 2018, when Xi Jinping and his supporters, who happened to occupy all the key party and government posts, changed the constitution so that the Chinese president, the leader of the formal government of China, what was called the party state army, which Xi Jinping happens to be, because he's the tripartite leader of them all, could have an extended tenure, i.e. what I call a termless or terminal tenure. He basically now has a right to continue in power as long as he and his supporters would hope to. Anyway, this really set off Xu Ranrun and a whole group, a large group, of thinking men and women, both in Beijing and throughout the country, who are concerned about the economic, political, and national fate and future of China. He's merely the man who we hear the clearest. He's not the only person who has made these comments, who's been critical, and who's offered suggestions on how China can move beyond its impasse. As I said, it's all available on ChinaHeritage.net under the Xu Ranrun archive, under projects. It's all there in great, painful, translated, annotated detail. I'll only mention one particular, why I got interested in this article, why I translated it, and how it relates back to Yan'an, and how it relates to Xi Jinping, and one of the main crises that China faces today and will continue to face until this issue, first raised 80-odd years ago in Yan'an, is somehow addressed. And this issue relates to this man, Wang Shiwei, who in 1942 wrote a very famous little essay when the party was encouraging its writers, speak up, tell us what you're thinking, young men and women. And three particular writers spoke up. I would later know and be befriended by two of them. Ai Qing, the poet, father of Ai Weiwei, who I first met in 1978, Ding Ling, well-known feminist writer, winner of the Stalin Prize for Literature as well, known as a Marxist-Leninist old bag in her last years because she was so extremely anti-everything, but a wonderful, delightful, hilarious woman from Hunan who I met in, again, 1977, just after she'd been brought back from exile and labor reform in Xinjiang. And there's this guy, Wang Shui. Wang Shui, we won't go into the great details. He was declared eventually to be a Trotskyite, and he was beheaded. One of his many crimes was basically he wouldn't give in after he was criticized. But he just said, among many other things, in his essay that he wrote at the time, 1942, called Wild Lilies, translated by, well, Kevin knows this work very well, translated by Timothy Cheek, who's, again, a colleague and friend from the 70s, who was studying in Australia under Pierre. He's now a professor at UBC in Vancouver. Among other things, Wang Shui said, we've come here, idealistic young people wanting to participate in the revolution, full of hope for the future of China, to break away from the autocracy of the past, to do all those things that Mao said to Huang Yanpei, we're doing. Wang Shui, and this is all happening just as Mao's having the dialogue with Huang Yanpei, Wang Shui said, yes, that's all fine, but in reality what's happened is there's a new class system. There's already entrenched privilege. There's already a type of party attitude that people who are on the outer should not be given a voice. We're already moving towards replicating all the things we're supposed to be opposed to. This is 1942, not 49, not 57, not 66, 1942. He sums up his critique in particular as one tag that's always remained famous, which is, here we have a place where 一分三色,十分无等. That means there are 3 different types of colored clothing depending on what level cadre you happen to be. And there's 5 different levels of food you can get depending on how important you are. These are all an indication of where our revolution is going. Xu Ranrun, in his essay, among the anxieties he mentions, the problems he mentions, is one of the things you communists must deal with is the long-term entrenched problem of corruption and not only corruption, but the special provisioning system, 特工制. The 特工制, you're probably not familiar with. Anybody who is in the party nomenclatura in China, the 24 or 28 levels of cadres in the communist system, have access, according to their rank and their position and their place in China, to special foods, special housing, special transportation, special access to education, special travel permissions, special access to luxury goods, all types of things. This is a privileged, highly secretive, privileged system. That is, when people talk about, oh, getting into the party means we can have some influence, have some power, that's all well and good. But it's about dollars and cents and lifestyle and access. And it has been important since the Yan'an era. It has remained a crucial issue in every major Chinese uprising and demonstration all these decades. I'll just mention 2 in relation to this. Sorry I'm going on, but I think you want to hear. I hope you want to hear all of this. 2. One of them, 1966. We all think of Red Guards rebelling at Mao's call and being violent and killing teachers and being outrageous, young, feral creatures. Terrible. When Red Guards, some of the Red Guards, I've done a lot of work on the Cultural Revolution period, made a movie with Karma Hinton and Richard Gordon called Morning Sun about the Cultural Revolution, interviewing the first Red Guards, as well as having been a person who lived through the last years of the Cultural Revolution and been aware of these things for most of my life. Many Red Guards and their supporters started killing cadres, of course because they wanted to oppose them, their ideology was bad and they weren't pro-Mao enough, but also because when they invaded and attacked party offices and committees in Beijing, in the provinces, in little towns, they discovered what the nomenclatura, the privileged party class, although they were poor, they were still privileged, what they had access to, how they'd been living, what they'd been eating in the Great Leap Forward as the country was starving to death. And they learned that the cadre system was providing special and unique support for tens of thousands of communist cadres while their neighbors and while the people they ruled over were dying in the street, literally dying in the street, in particular in Anhui, Zhejiang and places like that. And some of the Red Guard violence was because people were just so overwhelmed by outrage and disgust, they started killing, well, think of Animal Farm, they started killing the pigs. That's what they started doing. And this is one of the things that was immediately covered up at the time and is not mentioned to this day. So that's one thing. And remember 89. You remember the students first going to protest in the square. Many reasons. Bad food in their canteens. That was a major reason the demonstration started. No longer state allocation of jobs. A major reason students demonstrated. Why? Because if I don't have a privileged access to some special job, I'll have gone to Peking University and I'll get a shit job. Therefore, I feel that we want the state to allocate jobs. Otherwise, backdoorism and corruption and special influence will determine our future. But there's another reason people were protesting. They were protesting against Zhao Ziyang and his corrupt neoliberal global toadies. Remember that moment when the first dialogue between Yuan Mu, State Council spokesman, and the student demonstrators, Wang Dan and others, the students held up a chart and said, this is what we believe, with all the names of leaders, this is what we believe these leaders, the assets they control, and what their family members control. We demand the government carry out what's now called the Sunshine Policy. We demand that the assets of all the party leaders and the nomenclatura be announced. We demand an end to the type of corruption. Then they showed a picture of Zhao Ziyang playing golf. An end to this type of globalized capitalism that is creating incredible social inequities and huge problems for China. Don't forget, this is all beclouded later by all the talk about democracy and freedom and all that stuff. Part of the demonstration, part of the fury was to do with globalization and Zhao Ziyang. And also autocracy, and also all these other things. But to muddy these waters has meant that since 89, most people have completely misconceived what 89 was partially about. Don't forget the workers in the square all holding up Mao portraits. What was that about? I'd happy to tell you if we had the time. Do you remember the PLA? They come into Beijing, massacre people, and when the PLA start marching out, I remember people, journalists ringing me up with the marchers chanting the slogans. Overthrow corruption. 打倒腐败. That was the main slogan of the PLA soldiers who entered Beijing. So, as I said, these have been important things. So, as you know, Xi Jinping gets into power, carries out a major anti-corruption move. How does that link to all this? Oh, maybe it's a major moment because he's very anti-Hu Jintao and all this terrible corruption that took place under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao and the expansion of the Chinese economy and the nomenclatura using their special connections and power to gain access to global connections, to divvy up state assets and so on and so forth. All true. However, behind it all, behind Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, there's something else. Not Wang Shuwei, but our old friend, member of the Gang of Four, Zhang Chunqiao. Again, if I may bore you for a little history. Zhang Chunqiao came to influence, born in Shanghai of a writer's family, brilliant writer, a real commie theoretician, major, after Hu Qiaomu, perhaps the most important theoretician the Communist Party has produced, much better than Wang Huning, who's just an also-ran, but very important as well. Zhang Chunqiao in the late 1950s first influenced the local mayor of Shanghai, Ke Qingshi, and through him was able to get in touch with Mao, proposing a return to the Yan'an era in a series of theoretical essays. There's no way I'm going to stop at 3 minutes. I think people, you'll never hear this again, so you have to hear it from me, because otherwise, why did he bother coming here? Go back to the Yan'an era. What Wang Shui complained about, 3 levels of colors of clothing, 5 levels of food. Well, at the time, they were also carrying, the party's main economic policy was to carry out a gongji zhi. That is an allocation of resources according to your position and your needs. This is regarded as being relatively egalitarian, as it was. Because in relative terms, Yan'an was pretty incredible. One shouldn't forget the idealisms of it wasn't phony. Wang Shui was a critic, but it was, compared to the KMT and other places, an extraordinary moment in Chinese history. There's no doubt about it, so I don't want to belittle that. This gongji zhi was changed after 1949. They introduced a Soviet system of paying workers and others, and cadres and apparatchiks and so on and so forth, creating a new bureaucracy and a new, what you'd call a new capitalist class, in keeping with the Soviet model. This was highly contentious among party thinkers and others at the time. Zhang Chunqiao was one of the first people who gave theoretical articulation to the danger of what he saw unfolding and told Mao, what we need is a radical remake of our economic reality to avoid turning into a revisionist country. This is 57, 58. It's not 61, 62. And he proposes, when Mao was thinking about the push towards communism, the great leap forward, Zhang Chunqiao's ideas are part of the mix of that push. As you know, that led to disaster. We can't go into the details, and so on and so forth. But it led also to Mao's revived attempt to do a similar thing in 1964-5-6, which we know as the Cultural Revolution. One of the main aims of the Cultural Revolution, again underpinned partially by Zhang Chunqiao's ideas, and I said he's not isolated, but he's part of this mix of thinkers, is that China is becoming corrupt because its cadres have access to special privileges and so on and so forth that reproduces bourgeois behavior. And to prevent that, we must overthrow those in power who are taking a capitalist road. And by doing so, we'll limit special privileges, we'll overturn a bureaucracy that's turning Soviet and becoming highly corrupt, and we'll renew our revolutionary vigor. Why do I even care about this? Because in 1975, Zhang Chunqiao went at it again. In early 75, Zhang Chunqiao and Mao was the main man behind it, they issued a document that was printed on the front pages of every newspaper in China. I was a 20-year-old student, 20 years, 4 or 5 months old, and I read it in the press in early 75, February 75, which is called Study the 33 Quotations of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Mao on Bourgeois Rights. That's what it was called. 学习马恩列斯毛就资产阶级法权的33条语录. It's actually what it was called. That's what we had to learn, and that's why I can still remember it. And it was about what? It's about the same thing that Xi Jinping and these people are going on about today. It is about the revolution has happened, we've nationalized our assets, we've changed the fundamental underpinnings of our society. However, through our variegated wage system, through our privileges, through the party nomenclatura, through the different wages workers and peasants get according to their work, we are reproducing bourgeois and capitalist ideas every day in every way, as Lenin warned us we would. The only way to do this is to reduce those differences by cutting back the differential in wages, by restricting a luxury and privilege, and attacking corruption. This is early 75. This was to be the next stage of the Cultural Revolution that was pursued through 75 and 6 until it all collapsed with Mao's death. The issue of corruption came up again in the democracy war period in 1979 and was quickly quelled. Again in 1989, you remember, quickly quelled, I just mentioned it. And Xi Jinping is carrying on in this tradition. His anti-corruption campaign, if you look at the documents, you read what it's all about. It's about this long effort to use socialist methods to prevent the party from turning into a revisionist, excessively I mean, you think it's crazy. It's such a capitalist, it's state capitalism. However, I'm just talking about how they think about it and how they conceive it. So that's what got me interested in Xu Danrun, and that's why I ended up writing about him and translating him, because of this long tradition of issues to do with corruption, anti-corruption, the debate about accountability and oversight that has constantly bedeviled the Chinese Communist Party. And that relates to, and I very quickly have to move on. This is Xu Danrun himself at a very famous spot in Tsinghua University, a spot that commemorates intellectual freedom and spiritual independence. Set up in 1929, that extols the work of a famous scholar who committed suicide in 1927. The epitaph written by Chen Yunque, very famous, very famous figure. This saying, independent mind and free spirit, has underpinned the independent critiques in Beijing and elsewhere for the last 20 or 30 years, and Xu Danrun is one of the embodiments of this spirit. It's the same spirit that he used when he declared that I refuse to give in to the denunciations that I'm going through at the moment. He was, as you said, he's under investigation. And a few weeks ago, he published a new essay declaring his refusal to give in, and he just titled it, well, the words he used were, 老子不服,老子不怕. I will not submit and I will not be cowed. And here is a picture just before whatever's about to happen to him now. This is 2 weeks ago. Now to Hong Kong, if I may talk about Hong Kong, or should I just end here? I've still got stuff to say about Hong Kong, but I can stop.
Yes.
Hong Kong. So the saying, independent mind, unfettered spirit, how does that relate to anything that's happening in Hong Kong? So this, in Chinese, it is 自由之思想,独立之精神. That's the saying in Chinese. In Hong Kong in 2016, my old boss, a man by the name of Lai, leading commentator and writer in Hong Kong. I worked for him from 1977 to 1981, and I've translated his work on and off. In the 80s, quite a lot for the Asia Wall Street Journal. I've been translating his work again in the last 2 or 3 years. He's now 83 years old. 2016, he published this book called Independent Spirit and a Free Mind. And in it, he summed up the dilemma of Hong Kong today. And Li is somebody who has been talking about the dilemmas of Hong Kong and what would happen after the negotiations from remember when they first began, March 1979, the same time that Wei Jingsheng came up with this warning about autocracy. Mackelhaus and Deng Xiaoping first discussed the future of Hong Kong. And Li Yi was with him. He said, oh my God, this will be a disaster. We must do everything we can to try and encourage the British not to give in, not to give up the new territories in Hong Kong, because eventually they'll do to this place what they've done in Tibet and Xinjiang. So I've been aware of this for some time. And this is one of his collections of essays. He says, an independent spirit, why does that matter? This is from the introduction to this book. It's about being possessed of a mind that is neither dependent nor submissive. In the Chinese case, because of their system, their social environment and their political ideology, plus 2 millennia of autocracy back to Qin Shi Huang, most people's minds there, in Zhongguo, as you know, Hong Kong people refer to either the mainland or China. They don't refer to themselves as that. Because of that, they can't break free. Their minds aren't free. As Lu Xun, the man whose poem gave this talk its title, observed in 1925. You see, the Chinese, Lu Xun said, we've only ever had 2 modes of being these last 2 millennia. We have either go through periods when we long to be slaves, or we've gone periods when we've actually succeeded in becoming slaves. And that's what we face now. And just quoting them, this is Li's memoir at the age of 80. As I said, he's now 83. And he is somebody who has enthusiastically supported the Hong Kong protests. He's been overwhelmed and inspired by what he calls young Hong Kong. He said, I, for many years, have thought we were heading for this disaster. He has tried. He has been an advocate for critique, for demonstration, for disobedience since 1982. And I've been witness to all of it. He and many others. But nobody was really interested. As you remember, as Orville was just saying, Hong Kong is the poster child for the apolitical, economically interested, self-serving type of model city of global capitalism. It's the hothouse of everything the world should be. Just get on, make money, survive, and forget everything else, because what else do you need? Well, as we know, the young people of Hong Kong are telling us what we all need, and it's very clear, and they're doing it every day in many ways, loudly, often violently, and desperately. And this is the type of debate and discussion that has been riving the Chinese world, in fact, for over 100 years, since the May 4th movement. Anyway, Li supports and is enthusiastic, and I've just used this word cluster to give you some feel for the Hong Kong world. And this is, I'll just show you another aspect of this wonderful, obstreperous Hong Kong spirit that is summed up beautifully in this. If you know Cantonese, well, this is the Hong Kong Cantonese, unique thing. I'll read what this says, translated from its Romanized Cantonese English Hong Kong language. And it says, Hong Kongers, go to Victoria, it's just an announcement, go to Victoria Park tomorrow, Sunday the 18th of August. Don't only wear black and bring an extra piece of clothing and a laser pointer. You know how they use those to annoy people. Beware of infiltrators. If you come across someone who seems suspicious, guai, write the following down on a piece of paper. It's Cantonese romanization, which just simply says, do you know the fuck what I'm saying? And if they don't know what that means, they're a crook, they're a spy. We have 5 demands. They all must be met. Oh, fuck, help me distribute this, please. Now, this comes from the Facebook page of this delightful young lady, a well-known Hong Kong poet, writer, and high school teacher. Those of you who know this character, this uniquely new Chinese character created during this movement, I don't want to say it because it's rather vulgar. Well, I'll say it. It means freedom cunt. That's what that character said. Why has it occurred? It's used by demonstrators on T-shirts, Facebook pages by these seemingly innocent young ladies. It's because during one of the demonstrations, somebody was filming as a policeman was beating a woman and said, you fucking want freedom, you cunt. And that's what he said. Yes, he beat her. And this immediately went viral, and people said, yeah, I am a freedom cunt. So they changed the Chinese character, which hey in Cantonese word for cunt, and they added bits on the top to make it freedom cunt. And that's where the word comes from. Sorry to be so vulgar, but that's, if you're dealing with Hong Kong, you have to deal with a level of vulgarity. It's because that's what happens. It's just the language. Kitty Hung, and I'll just quote her very quickly and very quickly get to the end of all of this because I know I've been going on far too long. Kitty Hung and I have been translating a series of essays, interviews and stories by Hong Kong protesters, writers, commentators, young people, some of the young thugs. A lot of great stuff's appearing in the independent media in Hong Kong, and I've been doing my best to introduce my readers to some of it. And you can look at it under our website, China Heritage. Under projects, you go to The Best China, and there's a whole section called Hong Kong Apostasy. There's 35 chapters in this section so far. I'd like to add more to it. Kitty Hung makes a comment in her very wonderful essay that she wrote called the essay she wrote was, What Gives You Hong Kong People the Right to Resist? And it's an account of her engagement with mainland people who wish Hong Kong would just shut up. And she says, to most Chinese people, the mainlanders, Hong Kong is not so much a place populated by compatriots, by real people. It's just somewhere to shop. It's a city where they got a certain handbag or a particular item of clothing. That's all Hong Kong is, nothing more. When the brand starts acting up, speaking out of turn, and it isn't obedient anymore, well, they think, time to roll out 1.4 billion people and crush the bastards. The reality is that they've never given a damn about us, the way we live, or what we want. I think that sums up things very beautifully. I could go on and bore you with even more, but I think I should end there and let my friends and colleagues continue the morning. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, thanks, Jeremy, for that historical tour, and thanks to all of you for coming. Let's sort of dive right in here because time is short. There's no doubt that Chinese do have a real fascination with anniversaries and with history. And yet, on the other hand, I think, as you pointed out, Jeremy, there's also tremendous sort of ambiguity, ambivalence about having to observe these very anniversaries. So I want to ask you both, what is it about anniversaries in China that makes it so distinctive that they're like sort of radioactive pulses that keep popping up and demand either suppression or expression? And is this sort of manifestation of their tremendous wariness about letting history run free? Let's start with you.
Why anniversaries are important. I think dates, calling something as it is and putting a name on it is extraordinarily important. We might remember in the 1920s and 30s, there were 24 anniversaries just for national humiliation. There's only one now, but back then you can also create anniversaries as easily as you can erase them. So I think what Jeremy is talking about that brought out very nicely is how it is a moment where one could actually claim that history or try to appropriate it to a different purpose. And I think very well this October, the most recent National Day, demonstrates that.
But for a country which for so many millennia had history as sort of its basic reflective mirror, how is the party going to deal with this when history is so insubordinate and keeps snapping back in untoward ways? Oh. Well, either of you, but Jeremy.
Well, actually, you've talked a lot about this and thought about it. You said, I'd love to hear what you have to say, because as you know, Xi Jinping, with his major theoretical work, is trying to do just that, is to claim history and to rewrite what in non-official China is a terrible period of dynastic history, to rewrite it and claim it as being a part of a process that leads to us. So all points of history lead to me. That's how he's dealing with it, and that's how the party's dealing with it at the moment. It won't last, because, of course, thank heavens, biological attrition will deal with Xi Jinping's role in life. He'll die sooner or later. But the same thing will happen with the Communist Party itself, armed with the Hegelianism and the Marxism and Leninism as it does, with its historical mission, plus historical consciousness as determined by Chinese thought, will constantly be able to refer to itself as being the ne plus ultra of history. and therefore all other things must be elided. And the fight, as you've written in your own work, the fight for other histories and other voices will continue unabated.
So you both think that history matters still, and that despite the sort of infinite powers of the party, it's going to prevail.
Well, actually, that's a very interesting question. I think it brings us back to what you started with, the idea of 盛世. Are we just looking at a regression into the good old days of autocracy under Emperor Qing? And I think it's a very provocative question, because might remember this novel that was published in Hong Kong in 2013, 盛世, by Chen Guangzhong. So, and it's very much a dystopian, futuristic novel. It's about what happens in society where apparently that the entire society knows that they have forgotten something, but they cannot remember what it was. And it's very clearly a reference to the Cultural Revolution. So it's how does this society begin to feel those traces of that history, but without being able to name it? But I think even farther back, I think there's something about with every prosperous age, there comes a set of words of warning. That is anticipation and anxiety about the future. So it's very much, I think, just as Jeremy puts it back and to give it a longer historical frame, I like to push it forward and think about how is 盛世 a different kind of futurology. And I say this for different reasons. One is, so to put those two together, 盛世为言, so warning words in Prosperous Age, is actually the title of a treatise in 1893 by Zheng Guangying, who nowadays nobody really reads because he's considered proto-capitalist, essentially. 1893, but that was the first appearance, I should say, of the phrase 商战, trade war, in Chinese. And so Chinese have been thinking about, by the way, trade war and how to counter that for a very long time. But what I'd like to ask is, so what has changed? I mean, what makes the autocratic path forward? What makes the leadership so confident that's going to suspend the end of history? That is no longer be the cycle of or decline into decay, into chaos. And I think that raised the question of which I had not heard mentioned, which is what happened to dialecticism. That is very intrinsic to how the Chinese leadership have thought of their roles. And I think in particular it has its new roots, I think in 40s, 50s, with very precise ways of undoing dialecticism as a kind of controllable mathematical methodology.
Yeah, because if history has emotion, it's going to keep moving. But Xi Jinping sort of acts as if history has come to its final culmination and we can just freeze frame it.
But has he not, if you look at, again, that's the recent stuff, which I sadly have looked at mostly just out of interest and then started reading it, is this element that Deng Xiaoping introduces endless perfectibility of the system. 不断完善体制. And so they've subsumed the dialectic into something that are contradictions and oppositions and all the rest of it are now constantly at war in a healthy bureaucratic environment determined by us that can allow us, through this 全国成民主, which he's just announced, constantly seek perfection. And then it gains a kind of Chinese religiosity as well. It becomes some form of human perfectibility. And that's why we'll be a model for others. I'm just wondering if that's where things are going with this. If you look at the latest official documents and theoretical writings, this seems to be what they're proposing. I'm not a great believer in such things, but that's...
I mean, it's funny for a country that believed in dialectical materialism and history's irrevocable advance through time, and for us, the children of Hegel, who believe that history is moving towards a more open, optimistic, positive inevitability, right? And yet here we are sort of stalled.
Well, I would here invoke perhaps the modern heir of the Hegelian dialectics, which is actually the German intellectual historian Reinhard Koselleck, who actually distinguished this concept between the space of lived experience, what we know now, and the horizon of expectation, which is a future-looking plan. And what I see China doing is precisely ever trying to decrease and close that gap to ensure that the power that be, that the way they experience it now is also going to be the future. So what I'm asking is, so what in some ways we've been talking about, dissidents, and we talk about movements ongoing now. They very much disrupt that vision. But how has the party in some ways anticipated or is willing to accept that kind of disruption as part of the casualty, part of its dialectic perfectibility? So this is kind of raises the question of, we think of dissidents as something from the grassroots that's outside the system. But what if it's becoming increasingly part of the system?
Well, I would observe that in 88 in the second edition of my book, Seeds of Fire, which John mentioned, we use a Hungarian thinker, Miklos Haradzi, who wrote a very famous book called The Velvet Prison, which is about how an authoritarian communist system can subsume dissent or culture between the lines to help it perfect itself. So we use that to talk about contemporary China, and basically that formula in my mind hasn't changed all that much. The party is very adept. And that's why not only is it adept at assuming dissent in certain ways, I've argued in recent months that the dilemma of the Hong Kong situation or of Xinjiang or Tibet are not an abnormal development for the Chinese system. They are part and parcel of Xi Jinping's view of how society is. Constant struggle and conflict that justify power, control, manipulation, and help you embrace the types of differences in your own society that will help you get your people better on side. So struggle does lead to the type of talk of endless peace, but you have to have also constant struggle to maintain that peace.
And if we scale that up, exactly what you said, is 中国之治also newer rendition, I take it as 全球管理. So Xi Jinping in 2013 he talked about global governance. But it's interesting now he's talking about Chinese governance. So in the firmware instance, you're talking about the scope, right? A shared scope of governance. But now you're naming the agent that's going to do that. In some ways, I wonder if that is kind of worldview that China, Xi Jinping has, which is a world where China can expect and contain clashes like the trade war. It can contain problems in the BRI plan. But that is part of the perfectibility. It's all in the service of China's greatness.
I think so. Well, that seems to be where things are going. I think a series of major moves are unfolding in front of us right now. And I'm just getting glimmers. I could sort of scan the paper and guess, because I'm not a political scientist or anything like that. I just sort of, based on my many years of prejudice, I make my own reading. But I think you're right. Something is unfolding right now, very much engaged with the trade war, very much engaged with this, as you know, the constant contestation with America from the 40s to now, that is always informing mainland Chinese thought and behavior, official thought and behavior. But indeed, it's...
And then we have the added dimension, which it seems to me throws the whole equation out of balance, and that is the sort of techno-authoritarian side of things. I mean, whether the old sort of common wisdom about authoritarian governments eventually generating their own contradictions, whether that we may have something much more long-lived and durable because of the wedlock between old-fashioned Orwellian authoritarianism and new-style sort of techno, all of these facial recognition, social credits, all this stuff.
Well, it's true. It basically is a new prosthetic and a sort of augment the kind of old-styled ideology. And one question I ask myself is, how do we get here? How did it happen that China, Russia have a hand on, have managed in some ways to harness technology? Yes, to further their goals, whereas it seems much more disruptive for, let's say, American society when we think about what tech has done to us. Perhaps because we think of tech in this country as more, the singularity moment, right? There is a kind of techno-euphoria that has always underlined, I think, the Western context. This is minus the surveillance capitalism. I think a very good book on this issue. But I think for a place like China, tech serves a very pragmatic goal, governance. It is not looking for downloading your brain and having immortality in cyberspace. It is looking to solve an age-old problem. You have a gigantic population. Mass movements have never ended well in Chinese history. We can think of even recent history since the 19th century. It is terrified of mass movements turning, or even popular nationalism taking on a life of its own. So I think governance in many ways is much more low-tech than we think. I mean, we think about the kind of, as you know, the social credit system. All these are actually rather low-tech utilization. But it is true that it's collecting this sort of data, as we all have heard from various sources.
Yeah, I was just talking to a guy yesterday saying that even in neighborhoods now, the neighborhood committees have facial recognition systems. So as you walk down your hutong or into your apartment building, and it's all very well organized.
Well, you have your face scan when you're looking for toilet paper in the public restrooms. We know from a couple of years ago in Tiananmen. Right. I mean, this much toilet paper. But I should say, I like to say that in the West media, we always get the half story. So we hear scare, oh my gosh, now you need to have your face scanned to get toilet paper, how totalitarian is that? But it turns out it's either these older population, old people who don't have much money and they just and they live through the age, by the way, of extreme poverty in China. So they're thinking they can just kind of stock up on their toilet paper. And so they can save money. And this actually provoked a lot of discussion on Chinese internet. And people are saying, well, this is such a tragedy that old people can't even enjoy having toilet paper. What has our country come to? This is such a poor reflection on the Chinese people and our character. So it goes back to a kind of a shaming culture. So I like to say that techno governance is also tend to be hyped up about much more here because we think of it in those terms. But I think in China there's a lot of humanization and I think unexpected use, uncommon use of technology that we still don't know too much about.
I mean, just a very crude example is, until 10 days ago, Xu Guangrun and I, China's most famous, vocal, dissenting intellectual, were in constant contact via WeChat. Now, we're both aware, of course, the authorities want surveillance, they want to know what he's doing. However, there are many ways to do that. So we had, for a year and a half, we're in constant touch by WeChat. We're still in touch by email. How is that possible? I'm outraged, but we are. And it makes no particular sense. Other friends, he published something 10 days ago, which in Hong Kong is the introduction to his collected essays for the last 2 years. And it's very beautifully written. I'm translating it very hard, but extraordinarily critical of the authorities. He published it in Hong Kong. He was told not to. He did. Not a problem. Still wasn't banned. But then he sent it to about 150 of his friends. Everyone who received it was immediately banned from WeChat for a day. And they're not. And he has been permanently banned. So go figure.
It is. I think it's actually worth remembering that a lot of times when we talk about China, we really think of these old men, Xi Jinping and his cohort ruling every decision. But it's
What's
very
WeChat
complex.
You'll be saying to me?
It's pretty chaotic. It actually can be rather disorganized.
I think you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
So this raises an interesting question, and let me pose it to both of you. How is it that this society, I mean, when you're in China, you feel immense dynamism down at the level of startups and a lot of energy. How can it be that a society that on the one hand is sort of bubbling over with energy and dynamism can be ruled by a party that's as sort of old-fashioned and retrograde with so many sort of notions of control? How does that fit together?
That's such an interesting question. I think about this quite a bit because I was talking to a group of young Chinese CEOs, and it was remarkable how when you talk to American CEOs, they're really dynamic. They look like they just walked out of Google, trained there, and so they're throwing ideas around. But Chinese CEOs were very conservative in their family. They're mostly concerned about their family, where their children are going to go to school. And I think part of it is also you think about the difference in Chinese innovative and the cultural innovation is. In America, we think of gurus, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs. China already has a guru, and there can only be one, and that is Xi Jinping. So I feel like in some ways the cultural innovation necessarily follows that very top priority. And I recently read very interesting people talk about is innovation, as we have expected, I think, here, that innovation is going to democratize China, right, opening up. But actually there's a whole viewpoint that democracy is only necessary for the innovation phase of technology, not for the mass scaling, not for the controlling, not for the organizing, not for the export. So it's a complicated question, but I think one that we cannot wrap our heads around here because we think of it completely different.
And this actually touches on something a debate I've had with a very dear friend, Gloria Davies at Monash University. She's a famous translator of Chinese theoreticians and others and thinkers. Fantastic. She's Malaysian, Chinese, Australian, an interesting former punk rock singer and fashion model, so interesting background. But she's been a translator of some of the greatest major thinkers of China over the last 30 years. Innovative thinkers, conservative thinkers, and others. And she's been working on a project with these friends at UBC called Reading the China Dream, David Owenby and Tim Cheek and such, which is a great source of information about how thinking Chinese intellectuals, your major intellectuals, are proposing things. And Gloria and I have had a debate and disagreement for 20 years. And I said, what if, Gloria, the use of international up-to-date avant-garde or post-avant-garde and post-structuralist philosophy, thought, Gayatri Spivak or Derrida or whatever, what if it's not going to function the way you think it should function in freeing up intelligent exchange in the way that is path determined by your experience? What if the way that the majority of truly engaged, very intelligent and active Chinese thinkers actually create a sense of reality in a different way?
Yeah.
And if that is the case, then difference is not just something that Derrida talks about. It exists.
Yeah.
And if that's so, then one has to take it seriously, even if one might not like it or practice it oneself. And it can, of course, lead to a racist determinism. It can lead to all that stuff. But if there's different ways of actually ordering the world and making meaning, and this is something I've been interested in, particular since the rise of the new Mao cult from 1991 too, if there are different ways of ordering reality and seeing one's place in that order, then that requires
then we're not in a Shengshi, a new golden era. We're in some other new age. But I mean, let me pose this as a final question, and then we'll throw it open for a few questions from the audience. I mean, are we in? I mean, having come from Silicon Valley, where I live, I've learned long since every time you think there's a new thing and everything has changed, then it turns out you weren't right. But let me ask you both. Do you think we are heading off in some new historical era where all of the verities and commonplace wisdoms of the past are relevant in analyzing what's going to come?
You know, every generation on the cusp of change thinks that way, that they stand somewhere at the end of history. But I don't think so. That's my short answer.
Well, that's to the point.
Well, I'm a reactionary liberal humanist too. One of the reasons I like Xu Runrun's work is that he resonates with all the work of the past, yet he's a forward-thinking person, writing in a semi-classical style. But are the verities, is the basic nature, are we entering a post-human phase even? That's a big debate among theory. I don't think so. I think the same issues that bedevil us in terms of expression and thought and creativity and problems and those bedeviling things that make unique individuals what they are, that's all the same. The social arrangements are going through quite an interesting phase at the moment, but they've been going through quite an interesting phase my whole life. But then again, I was educated in the Cultural Revolution, so I find Xi Jinping's style of rule and the creation of problems in Hong Kong, Tibet, Xinjiang, I find that normal. Horrible, but normal. As for the rise of autocracy again, I find that unsurprising. As for your Trump, for example, remember...
My Trump?
Yeah, I mean, you're American. Yeah, I think the Chinese thing, I'm being terribly mean to you. But remember when the Tea Party came? I was creating a center on Chinese studies with Kevin's support in 2009-10, and I met with many people in Washington and elsewhere to discuss things. And they all asked, how do you see things going in America? What's your view? And I said, you no longer have a governable country. You have a constitutional crisis because of the Tea Party and the way your Congress and Senate work. My God, we're all worried because it'll screw all of us. And that was 10 years ago. But here we are, still bubbling along, and now there's a possible impeachment, and there's still an American Constitution that still means something. China's Constitution is endangered. This is what set Xu Runrun off. England is a complete mess. But America still has enough of good sense of process, at least.
Pretty modest.
It's grim, but I could try living somewhere where it doesn't exist.
I know, but Jeremy, at the same time, we have this China... it's the China Fang'an, the China option, the China Youshi, the China
solution,
the China model, all of these things sort of percolating out over there at the same time that we are sort of disassembling.
Well, as long as you don't, not all your pigs die and you don't have an economic crisis, it seems to be going okay. But remember, China, the Communist Party, one mustn't forget, and you've lived through this, and you know full well, Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution. China was a disaster zone, yet it put on a very brave face, and most people believed it.
Yeah.
So even as things go down and things crumble under Xi Jinping or not, the Communist Party will still create this wonderful, flowery vision of the Shengshi. That will continue unabated.
Well, that is true. I mean, even for those of us who were there in the Cultural Revolution, it was very hard to see what was really happening, and I wager it's the same circumstance today.
Exactly.
I mean, even Chinese have trouble seeing it.
Well, nobody expected a shootout would appear. No one expected that dozens of people, I didn't mention this, but dozens of leading intellectuals and students and others have come out and written about him and praised him, and I've translated all of that material. Major petitions have been launched. Leading government figures have secretly tried to protect him. These are all, unacceptable things. Shouldn't be happening, but they do. And that's just one little case.
All right, now I don't know if the audience has any appetite. Do we have a minute for one question? We're higher powers here.
1 minute.
Okay, well let's do some quick questions, and then What do you think is going to happen in Hong Kong? No, I have no idea.
Tiananmen Square, what's happening there? What do you think might happen here?
Well, I thought Tiananmen Square would happen nearly 8 months before it happened because of what they'd already been planning, martial law and so on and so forth. So I don't think, no, Hong Kong, they have, at the moment the debate in Hong Kong is, right now as of yesterday and today because of this latest violence at Chinese University of Hong Kong, which was generated by the police, not by the students. Because the communists are now they want to create social chaos, they want disorder, they want violence, they want to push it to the edge so the government can enact an emergency ordinance that will give the government boundless powers to close down the internet, to detain people, to confiscate property, to impose curfews. Only problem they have, and they've been debating it now for 6 months, is that it'll destroy the tourist industry, it'll ruin business, it'll screw up the real estate market, it'll devastate the stock market, it'll make Hong Kong ungovernable. They don't have enough police. They have 30,000 police, and if you look at rotations and the people who are actually on the street at any one time, 3,000 to 5,000 police only, actually on the street. They cannot do what they want to do, and they still don't want to call in the PLA, because then you will have
They have a battle of Algiers.
Yeah, you'll have a battle of Algiers. It's exactly, and we've seen this in many other climes and many other. So indeed, it's an extraordinary situation that incompetence in Beijing, married to inability and stupidity among the Hong Kong government, has led to this this uprising, unresolvable uprising. And even as we were saying earlier among ourselves, even if it somehow is quelled and quietens down in the next number of months, we don't know how, it has led to nearly 3 generations, kids from their early teens to their mid to late 30s, 3 generations of people will be in permanent rebellion against the People's Republic of China.
It's like Mao's generation.
Yeah.
But in Hong Kong.
What a mess.
Jing, any thoughts?
No, I thought I'd take another question.
Okay, one more question. We cut it off? Okay, getting our orders here. I'm sorry, but thank you all for coming. And
Sorry
Jeremy
for speaking
and
for too
Jing
long.
Xu, thank you so much.
Thank you.